It's raining outside. The roads are empty. Most people are asleep by now. But somewhere tonight, someone is hearing footsteps outside their tent. Someone is realizing they're not alone in their apartment. And someone is looking in their rearview mirror, wondering why the same car has been behind them for the last 100 miles. Tonight, you're about to hear 25 disturbing stories inspired by real fears, real places, and real people. Some take place deep in the wilderness. Others happen inside homes, hotels, hospitals, and along lonely highways in the middle of the night. So turn down the lights, get comfortable, and settle in. Because once these stories get into your head, they're hard to forget. Welcome to Nightmare Reads. A few years ago, I worked for a regional delivery company. Most of my routes were long-distance overnight runs through Oklahoma, Texas, and parts of New Mexico. The pay was decent, but the hours were brutal. A lot of people romanticize driving alone at night. Trust me, after enough hours on empty highways, it starts getting weird. You notice things, patterns, vehicles, people. The story happened during a route from Oklahoma City to Albuquerque. I left around sunset and expected to arrive sometime the following morning. For the first few hours, everything was normal. Traffic was light, weather was clear, nothing unusual. Around midnight, I stopped at a truck stop outside Amarillo to grab coffee and fuel. That's where I first noticed the pickup. An older white Ford. Nothing special. It was parked near the far side of the lot. I only remember it because the driver was sitting inside with the lights off. Not unusual by itself. Lots of drivers rest in parking lots. I grabbed coffee and got back on the road. About 40 minutes later, I noticed headlights behind me. The same white Ford. Again, not unusual. Highways are full of repeat traffic. But after another hour, it was still there. Same distance, same lane. Never passing. Never falling behind. I remember joking to myself that maybe we were both making the same trip. Eventually, I stopped paying attention. Around 2:30 a.m., I pulled into a rest area. I needed a break. I parked, used the restroom, stretched my legs, and bought a drink from a vending machine. The entire stop lasted maybe 15 minutes. When I came back outside, the white Ford was parked at the opposite end of the lot. Engine running, driver still inside, watching. At least that's what it felt like. I couldn't see the person's face, just a silhouette. Something about it made me uncomfortable. I got back on the highway. The truck followed. At that point, I started paying attention. Every time I changed lanes, they changed lanes. Every time I slowed down, they slowed down. If I accelerated, they accelerated. Always keeping distance, always behind me, never passing. Around 3:30 a.m., I called another driver from my company, mostly because I wanted somebody else to tell me I was overreacting. I explained the situation. He listened quietly. Then he asked one question. "Have you exited the highway yet?" I told him no. He said, "Do it." A few miles later, I took an exit into a small town. The white truck exited too. That instantly changed everything. There was no reason for them to follow me into town. The businesses were closed. The roads were nearly empty. Yet there they were, still behind me. My heart immediately started racing. I drove through several random turns. Left, right, left again. The truck copied every move. Now I knew. This wasn't coincidence. I was being followed. I called 911. The dispatcher told me to stay on the phone and drive toward the nearest police station. The closest one was about 15 minutes away. Longest 15 minutes of my life. The truck remained behind me the entire time, never getting too close, never backing off, just staying there, waiting, watching. When I finally pulled into the police station parking lot, the white Ford immediately turned around. No hesitation, no confusion. The second it saw where I was going, it left. Officers attempted to locate it. They never did. I figured that would be the end of it. I was wrong. About 2 weeks later, I stopped at another truck stop during a completely different route. Different highway, different state. As I walked back toward my vehicle, I noticed something parked near the edge of the lot. An older white Ford pickup. Same model, same missing front grille, same dent near the passenger side door. I froze. The driver never got out. The truck just sat there, engine running. The moment I looked directly at it, the headlights turned on. I got back in my vehicle and left immediately. The truck didn't follow me that time, at least not that I noticed. To this day, I don't know who was inside. Maybe it was some unstable person. Maybe someone looking for an easy victim. Maybe something else entirely. What bothers me most is that they never approached me, never threatened me, never even tried to make contact. They just followed, for hours. And somehow that made it worse, because if somebody follows you across hundreds of miles without saying a word, you start wondering what would have happened if you'd stopped somewhere more isolated, and whether they were waiting for exactly that. Last winter, I was living alone in a small rental house outside Columbus, Ohio. The neighborhood wasn't bad. Quiet streets, mostly families. Nothing ever really happened there. That's probably why I ignored the first warning sign. It was a Wednesday night. I was up late finishing work on my laptop. Around 12:20 a.m., I heard knocking. Not loud knocking, just 3 slow knocks. At first, I thought maybe I'd imagined it. Then it happened again. 3 more knocks. I checked my phone. No messages, no missed calls. Nobody I knew would randomly show up after midnight. I walked toward the front door but stopped before opening it. Instead, I looked through the peephole. I couldn't see anyone. The porch light was on. The front steps were empty. For a moment, I thought maybe some kids were messing around. Then I heard a voice. A young woman. She sounded scared. "Please, can somebody help me?" I immediately felt guilty. She sounded genuinely upset. I looked through the peephole again. Still nobody. Then I realized why. The person wasn't standing directly in front of the door. She was standing off to the side, just outside the peephole's view. "Please," she said again. My phone died. I need help. Everything in me wanted to open the door, but something felt wrong. I asked her what happened. There was a pause. Then, she said she had been walking home when someone started following her. She sounded nervous, maybe even frightened. But there was something strange about her answers. Every question I asked got a vague response. No street names, no details, nothing specific. Just enough information to keep me talking. I told her I'd call police for another pause, longer this time. Then she said no, don't call police. That immediately changed the situation. If somebody is genuinely afraid, police are usually the first thing they want, not the last. I stepped away from the door and quietly checked my security camera app. I had cameras covering the front yard and driveway. The moment the feed loaded, my stomach dropped. The woman was there. But she wasn't alone. 2 men were hiding behind a hedge near my porch, completely out of sight from the front door. A 3rd man was standing near the side of my garage, watching the house. Waiting, the woman continued talking, still pretending to need help. Meanwhile, the men never moved. I remember feeling my heart pounding so hard I could hear it. If I had opened that door, those guys would have been less than 10 feet away. I immediately muted my phone and called 911. The dispatcher told me to stay inside and remain quiet. While I was talking to her, the woman kept knocking, still asking for help, still acting desperate. Then one of the hidden men stepped closer to the porch. I watched him on the camera. He looked directly at the front door, almost like he was getting impatient. Several minutes later, something changed. The woman stopped talking. One of the men pulled out a phone. Seconds later, all 3 looked toward the street. Then they left. Fast, the woman practically jogged away. A minute later, police vehicles entered the neighborhood. The group was gone before officers arrived. Police searched the area, but couldn't find them. What bothered me was what officers told me afterward. Apparently, there had been several similar reports in nearby towns. A woman asking for help. Late at night. Always near isolated homes. Always with other people hiding nearby. Nobody knew whether they intended robbery, home invasion, or something worse. The tactic worked because it exploited basic human instinct. Most decent people want to help. I know I did. Honestly, if I hadn't installed those cameras a few months earlier, I probably would have opened the door. And if I had, I don't like thinking about what would have happened next. Now I have a simple rule. If someone knocks on my door after midnight asking for help, I'll absolutely call emergency services. But I'm not opening that door. Because sometimes the scariest thing isn't the person asking for help. It's the people waiting for you to let them in. Back when I was 21, I worked the overnight shift at a gas station off Highway 50 in Nevada. If you've never driven that stretch of road, it's basically endless desert, miles and miles of nothing. No neighborhoods, no businesses, no people, just highway. The station itself was open 24 hours, but after midnight, it became a ghost town. Most nights I'd see maybe 3 or 4 customers between midnight and sunrise. The job was boring, until one particular night. It was around 3 a.m. Rain was coming down harder than I'd ever seen in that area. The parking lot was completely empty. I was restocking cigarettes behind the counter when an old pickup truck pulled in. The truck looked rough, rust everywhere, one headlight out, mud covering most of the license plate. The driver parked directly in front of the entrance. He sat there for nearly a minute before getting out. That was the first thing that felt strange. Most customers either come inside immediately or stay in their vehicles. This guy seemed like he was preparing himself. Eventually, he stepped out and walked in. The moment he entered, I noticed something. He was soaked, not from the rain, from sweat. His clothes looked damp despite the cold weather, and he kept glancing over his shoulder toward the parking lot, almost like he expected someone to be there. He walked straight to the cleaning aisle. A few minutes later, he approached the counter carrying 2 bottles of bleach, heavy-duty garbage bags, rubber gloves, paper towels, and a roll of duct tape. Not illegal, not even unusual by themselves. But together, at 3 a.m., it definitely caught my attention. I scanned the items and made small talk, just trying to be friendly. The guy barely responded. Every answer was one word, short, dismissive. His hands shook while he counted cash. Then he asked a question, a weird question. He said, "How long does your security footage stay stored?" I laughed awkwardly. Honestly, I thought he was joking. He wasn't. He stared at me, waiting. I told him I didn't know. The footage was handled by corporate. He nodded slowly, then left. That should have been the end of it, but it wasn't. About 20 minutes later, a state trooper entered the station. He looked tired, the kind of tired you only see on night shifts. He walked up and asked if I'd seen a pickup matching a certain description. My stomach immediately dropped. It was the same truck. I told him yes. The trooper asked what the driver bought. When I listed the items, his expression changed instantly. He asked if I could show him the receipt. I printed a copy. The trooper photographed it. Then he thanked me and left. I spent the rest of the shift wondering what was going on. The next afternoon, I got my answer. The story was all over local news. A woman had escaped from a vehicle during a traffic stop attempt nearly 50 miles away. According to investigators, she had been held against her will for several days. The suspect was the same man who visited the gas station, the same guy who bought bleach, the same guy who asked about security cameras, the same guy standing 5 feet away from me while I made small talk. Police arrested him later that morning. What bothered me wasn't that he turned out to be a criminal. It was how normal he seemed. If you'd walked into the station at the same time, you wouldn't have noticed anything. No mask, no weapon, no dramatic behavior. Just another customer. That's what stuck with me. We grow up expecting dangerous people to look dangerous. Most don't. Most look completely ordinary. A few months after the arrest, investigators contacted the station. They wanted surveillance footage from that night. While reviewing it, I noticed something I'd missed before. The suspect wasn't looking at the parking lot when he kept glancing outside. He was looking at the passenger side of his truck, the side I couldn't see from behind the register, the side where investigators later said the victim had been sitting, watching, waiting for an opportunity to escape. I still work nights occasionally, but every time someone walks up to the counter carrying an oddly specific combination of items, I pay attention, because sometimes the scariest customers aren't the ones causing a scene. They're the ones quietly trying not to attract attention at all. About 4 years ago, I was driving home through northern Colorado after visiting family. It was late, a little after midnight. The weather had turned bad about an hour earlier. Heavy rain, strong wind, poor visibility. The roads were almost empty. Normally, I would have stayed the night somewhere. But I had work the next morning and wanted to get home. Looking back, I wish I'd just gotten a hotel. Around 1 a.m., I noticed someone standing near the shoulder of the highway. At first, I thought it was a road sign. Then my headlights caught reflective strips on a rain jacket. It was a person, standing completely still, in the rain, miles from the nearest town. I drove past, then immediately felt guilty. The weather was terrible. The guy looked stranded, so I turned around. When I pulled up beside him, he didn't seem surprised, almost like he'd been expecting someone to stop. He was a man in his late 20s or early 30s, thin, clean-shaven. No luggage, no backpack, no phone in his hands, nothing. That was the first thing that felt odd. Most stranded people have something with them. This guy didn't. I rolled down the window and asked if he needed help. He nodded, said his vehicle had broken down several miles back. He claimed his phone battery had died, and asked for a ride to the next town. The story sounded reasonable enough, so I unlocked the passenger door. He climbed in. For the first few minutes, everything seemed normal. We made small talk, talked about the weather, road conditions, nothing unusual. Then he started asking questions, personal questions, where I lived, whether I lived alone, what time I usually got home from work. At first I assumed he was just making conversation, but the questions kept getting more specific and more uncomfortable. I remember trying to redirect the conversation several times. Each time he'd eventually circle back to me. Not himself, me. Then I noticed something. Every answer he gave about himself was vague. I knew almost nothing about him, yet he'd learned quite a bit about me. That realization made me uneasy. About 20 minutes into the drive, I asked where exactly he wanted to be dropped off. He pointed toward a small town up ahead. Then he said something strange. He mentioned a side road. A road we hadn't reached yet. A road that wasn't visible from where we were. I asked how he knew it was coming up. He paused, then said he'd driven through the area before. The answer sounded rehearsed. For the first time, I started wondering whether his story about the broken-down vehicle was even true. A few minutes later, we passed the location where he claimed his vehicle had been stranded. There was nothing there. No car, no truck, nothing. The passenger noticed me looking. Neither of us said anything. The silence inside the vehicle became uncomfortable. Then my phone rang. It was my brother. I answered using the hands-free system. The passenger immediately became quieter. My brother asked where I was. I told him, then casually mentioned I was giving somebody a ride. The atmosphere changed instantly. The man stopped asking questions, stopped talking entirely. He simply stared out the window. Several minutes later, we reached the town. He asked me to pull over near a gas station. The place was open and fairly busy despite the hour. The moment I stopped, he opened the door. Before leaving, he looked back at me and smiled. Then he said, "Good thing somebody knows where you are," and stepped out. I sat there frozen, watching him walk away. Something about that comment bothered me a lot. I drove home and tried to forget about it. A few days later, I couldn't, so I contacted local law enforcement, mostly because the whole encounter felt wrong. I gave them the location where I'd picked him up. The officer I spoke with asked for a description. Then there was a pause, a long pause. Eventually, he told me something I still think about. Several motorists had reported encounters with a man matching that description over the previous year. Always late at night, always on isolated highways, always claiming to be stranded. The stories were remarkably similar, friendly at first, then increasingly personal questions. Nobody knew exactly what he wanted, but enough reports had accumulated that officers were aware of him. The officer thanked me and advised me not to pick up hitchhikers in the future. I haven't since. What bothers me most isn't what happened. It's what didn't happen. Maybe he was harmless. Maybe he wasn't. Maybe he was just socially awkward. Or maybe he was trying to figure out whether anybody would notice if I disappeared. I'll never know. But I do know this. The last thing he said wasn't a joke. It sounded like a genuine observation. And every time I think about it, I come to the same conclusion. If my brother hadn't called when he did, that ride might have ended very differently. A few years ago, I rented a small, one-bedroom apartment near the hospital where I worked. The building was old, but affordable, which was enough for me at the time. I worked long shifts, sometimes 16 hours or more, so most days followed the same routine. Go to work, come home, sleep, repeat. The strange things started so gradually that I barely noticed them. At first it was little stuff, a kitchen cabinet left open, a glass sitting on the counter that I didn't remember using, food disappearing slightly faster than expected. Nothing major, nothing that couldn't be explained away by exhaustion. I was working ridiculous hours at the time. I blamed everything on that. Then I started noticing noises, usually late at night, soft sounds from above my bedroom ceiling, tiny movements, almost like someone shifting their weight. The building was old, so I figured it was settling. Maybe squirrels, maybe pipes. I mentioned it to the landlord once. He checked the attic and told me there was nothing up there. For a while, I accepted that explanation. Then things got worse. One weekend, I drove out of town to visit my parents. I left Friday afternoon and returned Sunday evening. The moment I walked into my apartment, something felt wrong. I couldn't explain it. The air felt different. The bedroom smelled stale, almost like somebody had been living there. When I entered the room, I immediately noticed the ceiling access panel. It was slightly open, only by an inch or two, but I knew for a fact it had been closed before I left. My stomach dropped. I grabbed a chair from the kitchen and climbed up. Part of me expected to find a raccoon, or maybe nothing at all. Instead, I found one of the most disturbing things I've ever seen. There was a mattress, not an old mattress somebody had stored years ago, a recently used mattress. There were food wrappers, water bottles, blankets, and a duffel bag. Someone had been living above my ceiling. I climbed down immediately and called police. When officers searched the crawl space, they found even more: extra clothing, flashlights, chargers, several notebooks, and dozens of photographs. Photographs of me, sleeping, watching television, cooking, coming home from work. Whoever had been up there wasn't just hiding. He had been watching me, studying me, learning my routine. The suspect wasn't there when police arrived, but they eventually caught him a few days later, attempting to enter another apartment building. According to investigators, he had been secretly living inside vacant spaces and crawl areas of residential buildings for years. He knew how to avoid being noticed, how to move quietly, how to enter apartments when tenants were away. The idea that somebody had been living just a few feet above my bed for weeks still makes me sick. I moved out immediately. That was 3 years ago. Even now, whenever I hear a noise above my ceiling, I stop what I'm doing and listen. Because once you discover someone has been secretly sharing your home, you never really feel alone again. We've only scratched the surface so far. Out of the first 6 stories, which one got to you the most? Was it the figure outside the tent, the voice outside the door, or something else entirely? Let me know in the comments below. I always enjoy seeing which stories affect people differently. Now let's keep going. A few years ago, I was photographing wildlife in a remote valley in Washington state. I'd been trying for almost 3 days to get a decent shot of a lynx that had been spotted in the area. It wasn't exactly a popular hiking destination. In fact, once you got a few miles past the marked trails, it was rare to see another person. That was part of the appeal. I packed light, hiked nearly 10 miles into the valley, and found a spot near a small clearing surrounded by thick trees. There was no cell service, no cabins, and no roads for miles, just wilderness. The forecast called for rain overnight, so I set up my tent before dark and settled in early. Looking back, there were a few things that felt off, not supernatural, just off. Around sunset, I noticed an old fire ring about 50 yards from my campsite. That wasn't unusual. What was unusual was how fresh it looked. The ashes were still dark. There were beer cans nearby that hadn't rusted yet. Someone had been there recently. I remember wondering why they would camp so far off trail. Still, I didn't think much of it. By 10 p.m., rain started falling. At first, it was light. Then it became one of the heaviest storms I've ever camped through. The rain hammered the tent so hard it was almost impossible to hear anything else. Eventually, I fell asleep. I woke up sometime after 2 a.m., not because of a sound, because of a feeling. You know those moments where your brain wakes you before your body catches up? That's what it felt like. For a few seconds, I just lay there listening to the rain. Then I realized something. There was movement outside, not animal movement. Footsteps, slow footsteps. I froze immediately. The sound circled around the tent, crunch, crunch, crunch. Whoever it was wasn't trying to be quiet. That was the first thing that scared me. If it had been a hiker looking for help, they would have called out. If it had been another camper, they would have introduced themselves. This person just kept walking around the tent, slowly, methodically, like they were inspecting it. I checked my phone, 2:17 a.m. My heart started pounding. I remember reaching for my flashlight and then stopping myself. Part of me wanted to shine it through the tent wall. The other part knew that if somebody was standing out there watching me, I didn't want them knowing I was awake. The footsteps stopped, right next to the tent, less than a few feet away. I could hear rain dripping from their clothing. I could hear them breathing. And for a moment, I genuinely thought they were about to unzip the door. Instead, they stayed completely still. I've never experienced silence like that. Not because there was no noise, because somebody was standing inches away from me and neither of us was moving. After what felt like several minutes, the footsteps started again. They moved around the back of the tent, then to the other side, then back to the front, over and over. I don't know how long it lasted. Maybe 30 minutes, maybe an hour. Time felt completely distorted. At one point, I heard metal lightly tapping against something, almost like someone was holding keys or a pocket knife. I remember gripping the small canister of bear spray I kept beside my sleeping bag, not because I thought it would help much, just because it was the only thing I had. The rain finally started easing up around dawn. The footsteps had stopped by then. I never heard anyone leave. That's what bothered me most. I heard them arrive. I heard them circle the tent, but I never heard them walk away. When daylight finally came, I waited another 20 minutes before opening the tent. The woods looked completely normal. No one was there, but the ground around the campsite told a different story. The mud was covered in footprints, human footprints, dozens of them. They formed a rough circle around my tent. Whoever had been there spent a long time walking around it. I followed the tracks a short distance. They led toward the old fire ring I'd noticed the evening before, and that's where I found something that made me leave immediately. A folding chair, still set up, facing my campsite. Not facing the fire, facing my tent. Beside it was a cigarette butt that was still dry underneath the chair despite the storm, meaning someone had been sitting there recently, watching. I packed faster than I ever have in my life. The entire hike back, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was somewhere in the trees keeping pace with me. Maybe it was paranoia. Maybe it wasn't. I never saw anyone. But every few minutes, I'd hear a branch snap somewhere behind me. Far enough away that I couldn't see anything. Close enough that I noticed. I finally reached my truck around noon. As soon as I had service again, I called a ranger station and reported what happened. The ranger asked me exactly where I'd been camping. I gave him the location. There was a long pause. Then he asked me something I'll never forget. He said, "Did you happen to notice an old fire ring near your campsite?" The second he said that, my stomach dropped. I told him yes. Another pause. Then he said, "You're not the first person who's reported someone watching campsites from that area." I asked if they'd ever caught whoever it was. He said no. The reports had been coming in for years. Different descriptions, different campers, same location. Nobody had ever managed to identify the person responsible. I haven't camped alone since, and whenever people tell me they're more afraid of bears than people in the wilderness, I always tell them the same thing. At least, bears don't spend hours standing outside your tent just watching you sleep. Last fall, I took a solo backpacking trip into the North Cascades. Nothing extreme. Just a few days away from work, away from my phone, away from people. I had done plenty of solo trips before and never had any problems. In fact, being alone was the whole point. The first day went smoothly. I hiked about 8 miles into the backcountry, found a decent campsite near a small clearing, and settled in before dark. The nearest established campground was several miles away. As far as I knew, I was completely alone. Around sunset, I noticed something strange, not alarming, just strange. While collecting firewood, I found a fresh boot print near a muddy section of trail. It looked recent. The edges were still sharp. I figured another hiker must have passed through earlier. No big deal. Still, I remember feeling slightly disappointed. Part of me had hoped I was the only person out there. By 9 p.m., darkness had completely swallowed the forest. I finished dinner, put out the fire, and climbed into my tent. The woods were quiet. Not unusually quiet, just normal wilderness quiet. I was scrolling through downloaded podcasts when I heard something. A voice, faint, far away. At first, I couldn't make out the words. I removed one earbud and listened carefully. The voice came again. This time I heard my name, Mark. I immediately sat up. My heart skipped. I knew nobody should know I was there. I hadn't told anyone exactly where I was camping. The voice came again. Mark. It sounded distant, maybe 100 yards away. For a few seconds, I convinced myself I was imagining it. Then it happened again. Same name, same voice. My stomach tightened. The voice sounded familiar. Not exactly like my girlfriend. Not exactly like anyone I knew, but close enough to get my attention. I unzipped the tent slightly and listened. Nothing, just wind moving through the trees. Then I heard a branch snap, somewhere behind my campsite. I grabbed my flashlight and swept the beam through the forest. Nothing. No movement. No reflection. No person. Just trees. I zipped the tent closed and tried to relax. A few minutes later, the voice returned. Closer. Mark. This time, there was no mistaking it. Someone was out there, and they knew my name. I felt genuine fear for the first time. Not because of what I heard, because of what it implied. The nearest trailhead was miles away. There should not have been anyone wandering around my campsite after dark, especially someone who knew my name. I stayed quiet, completely quiet. Then I remembered something. Earlier that day, I'd left my backpack unattended near a trail junction while filling water bottles, only for a few minutes, long enough for someone to see it. My name tag was attached to the pack. Suddenly, the situation made a lot more sense, and somehow that made it worse, because it meant there was likely a real person outside. Not an animal, not my imagination, a person. The voice continued every 10 or 15 minutes, never yelling, never approaching directly, just calling my name from different parts of the forest, sometimes from the left, sometimes from behind the tent, sometimes from farther away, almost as if someone was circling the campsite, testing me, waiting for a response. I never answered. Around midnight, I heard footsteps, actual footsteps, slow, deliberate, moving through wet leaves. They stopped near the edge of the clearing. I held my breath. The footsteps stopped too. Whoever it was knew exactly where my tent was. We stayed like that for what felt like forever, neither of us moving. Then the footsteps slowly retreated back into the woods. I didn't sleep at all that night. I just sat there gripping my flashlight and bear spray, waiting for daylight. When the sun finally came up, I packed faster than I ever had before. Before leaving, I checked around the campsite. That's when I found them. Footprints, several different sets. Human footprints, not animal tracks, not old prints, fresh ones. Some of them were less than 20 feet from my tent. The worst part was discovering a crushed energy drink can near the tree line. It hadn't been there the previous evening. Someone had been watching for hours. I hiked out immediately. When I reached the ranger station near the trailhead, I mentioned what happened. The ranger listened carefully. Then he asked, "Did the person ever ask for help?" I said no. The ranger nodded. Apparently, there had been several reports that year involving a man approaching solo campers after dark. Sometimes he would call out names. Sometimes he'd pretend to be lost. Sometimes he'd claim to be injured. The goal was always the same: get the camper to leave their tent. Nobody knew exactly what he wanted. Nobody ever got a good look at him. But enough people reported similar experiences that the rangers had started warning solo hikers. I haven't stopped camping, but I don't camp alone anymore. And I definitely don't put my name anywhere visible on my gear. Because if a stranger in the wilderness already knows your name, they've probably been watching you longer than you realize. Last summer, I took a solo camping trip in northern Idaho. Nothing extreme, just a weekend away from work. The location wasn't an official campground. It was a clearing I'd found during a previous hiking trip. Remote enough that I usually didn't see another person for days. That was exactly why I liked it. The drive took almost 3 hours. By the time I finished setting up camp, the sun was already beginning to set. Everything felt normal, quiet, peaceful. The kind of place where you can actually hear yourself think. Around dusk, I decided to explore the area a little before it got dark. I followed a game trail about a quarter mile from camp. That's when I noticed the first thing that felt wrong. A folding chair, just sitting there, by itself, facing toward my campsite, not facing a trail, not facing a view, facing directly toward the clearing where my tent was set up. I remember standing there for several seconds, trying to make sense of it. Maybe another camper left it behind, maybe a hunter. Whatever the explanation was, I didn't like it. I returned to camp and tried to forget about it. As darkness settled in, the forest became completely quiet. Nothing unusual, just normal nighttime sounds. By around 11 p.m., I climbed into my tent and went to sleep. Sometime after 2 a.m., I woke up. At first, I wasn't sure why. Then I heard it, a single footstep. Not an animal, a human footstep. Slow, deliberate. Somewhere near the edge of the clearing. I immediately froze. For several seconds, there was nothing. Then another step. Crunch. Then silence. Crunch. Then silence again. The sound moved slowly around the campsite. Not approaching, not leaving, just circling. I reached for my flashlight, but didn't turn it on. Part of me wanted to look outside. The other part knew that if someone was watching the tent, I didn't want them knowing I was awake. The footsteps continued for nearly 20 minutes, always moving, always stopping, never getting closer than the tree line. At one point, I heard what sounded like metal lightly tapping against something. Maybe keys, maybe a tool. I couldn't tell. Then everything stopped. Complete silence, the kind of silence that makes you listen even harder. I don't know how long I sat there. Maybe an hour, maybe longer. Eventually, exhaustion caught up with me. I must have fallen asleep. When morning came, I almost convinced myself I'd imagined the entire thing, until I stepped outside. The ground around my campsite was covered in footprints. Human footprints, fresh, several different sizes. My stomach immediately dropped. I followed them carefully. Most disappeared into the woods, but one set led back toward the folding chair I'd found earlier. When I reached it, I noticed something I hadn't seen the day before. An empty water bottle, a cigarette butt, and fresh boot prints all around the area. Someone had been sitting there recently, watching. The chair wasn't abandoned. It was being used. I packed my gear immediately. As I loaded everything into my truck, I kept scanning the tree line. The entire time, I had the feeling somebody was still nearby, just out of sight, watching me leave. On the drive home, I stopped at a small ranger station and mentioned what happened. The ranger listened quietly. Then he asked exactly where I'd been camping. When I showed him the location, he sighed. Apparently, several solo campers had reported similar experiences over the previous year. Unknown individuals watching campsites from a distance, following hikers, appearing near remote clearings. Nobody had ever managed to identify them. No arrests, no clear explanation, just reports, lots of reports. The ranger advised me not to camp alone in that area again. I haven't. People always assume the wilderness is dangerous because of animals. Bears, mountain lions, wolves. Honestly, none of those things worry me much, because animals usually make their intentions obvious. People don't. And if someone is willing to spend an entire night sitting in the woods watching your campsite, you have no idea what they're thinking. And that's the part that still bothers me. I've spent most of my adult life outdoors. I've camped in deserts, mountains, forests, and places so remote you can hike for days without seeing another person. Because of that, I don't scare easily. At least I didn't used to. A couple years ago, I took a solo trip into Olympic National Forest during the fall. The weather forecast called for heavy rain, which didn't bother me. If anything, I enjoy camping in bad weather. The trails are empty. The forest feels more peaceful. At least, that's what I thought before this trip. I reached my campsite late in the afternoon. It wasn't an official campground, just a small clearing I'd found before on previous trips. The nearest road was miles away. There was no cell service, no nearby cabins, nothing. By nightfall, the storm had arrived. Rain hammered the trees. Wind pushed through the forest in long, powerful bursts. The weather was exactly what I expected. Around midnight, I woke up. At first, I couldn't understand why. Then I realized something was missing. The storm. The rain had stopped. The wind had stopped. Everything had stopped. I don't mean it became quiet. I mean completely silent. No rain. No insects. No movement. Nothing. The silence felt unnatural, like someone had muted the entire forest. I checked my watch, 12:41 a.m. For a while I just listened, waiting for the weather to return. It didn't. Eventually curiosity got the better of me. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside. The first thing I noticed was the fog. A thick layer of fog had settled over the forest. Visibility was maybe 30 yards. Beyond that, everything disappeared into gray. The second thing I noticed was the smell. Cigarette smoke. Fresh cigarette smoke. My stomach tightened immediately. Nobody should have been out there. especially not in the middle of the night. I switched off my flashlight and listened. That's when I heard it, a cough, somewhere in the fog. Not close, but not far either. Definitely human. I stood completely still. A few seconds later, I heard another cough. Different direction, then another, and another. My heart started racing. There wasn't one person out there. There were several. I slowly scanned the fog. At first, I thought I was imagining things. Then I saw movement, a silhouette, standing between two trees, maybe 50 yards away, just standing there, watching. I flashed my light toward it. The figure disappeared instantly. I told myself they were probably campers, maybe another group using the area, maybe hunters, but something didn't feel right. Normal people don't stand silently outside somebody's campsite at 1 a.m. Then I noticed another silhouette, and another. Different directions, different distances. None of them moving, none of them speaking, just standing there. The realization hit me all at once. I was surrounded, not closely, but enough. I counted at least 5 figures, possibly more. The fog made it impossible to tell. Every survival instinct I had was screaming that something was wrong. I quickly climbed back into my tent and locked the zipper shut. Not that it would have helped much. For the next several hours, I sat there listening. Occasionally, I'd hear a cough, a footstep, a branch breaking. But nobody approached the tent, nobody called out, nobody identified themselves. They simply stayed out there, somewhere beyond the trees, waiting, watching. The strangest part was the silence. The storm never returned. The forest remained completely still all night. I don't think I slept for even a minute. Just before sunrise, I heard vehicle engines, several of them, distant at first, then gradually fading away. A few minutes later, birds started chirping again. The wind returned. The forest came back to life. It was as if someone had flipped a switch. I waited until full daylight before stepping outside. The fog was gone. The woods looked normal again, but there were signs, lots of signs, fresh boot prints, tire tracks, several crushed cigarette butts, and something else. About 60 yards from my campsite, partially hidden behind a tree, was an empty folding chair, positioned directly toward my tent. That bothered me more than anything. Someone had deliberately sat there watching. For how long, I have no idea. I packed immediately and headed for the trailhead. When I reached the ranger station, I mentioned what happened. The ranger listened carefully. Then he asked where exactly I'd been camping. I showed him the location on a map. His expression changed immediately. He told me that area had become a problem recently. Illegal gatherings, unregistered camps, people using remote sections of forest land to avoid attention. Law enforcement had responded several times, but rarely found anyone. Most groups disappeared before officers arrived. The ranger couldn't tell me exactly who the people were. And honestly, I didn't ask. I didn't want details. I already knew enough. What stays with me isn't the idea that there were people out there. It's the way they acted. No talking, no campfires, no attempts to approach. Just silent observation, as if they were waiting to see what I would do. I've camped plenty of times since then. But whenever a forest suddenly becomes too quiet, I don't go looking for the reason anymore. Because sometimes the silence isn't nature. Sometimes it's people, and people are usually the thing you should be most afraid of. A few years ago, I was driving through rural Kentucky after visiting a friend. It was late, much later than I'd planned. The route home took me through a network of back roads that cut across farmland and wooded areas. Normally, I would have taken the highway, but my GPS suggested a shortcut. At first, everything seemed fine. The roads were empty, no traffic, no houses. Just miles of darkness broken occasionally by old barns and mailboxes. Around midnight, my phone lost signal. Not unusual for that area. Still, it made me slightly uncomfortable. About 30 minutes later, I realized I hadn't seen another vehicle in nearly an hour. Then I noticed something strange, a light, far off in the distance. At first, I assumed it was another farmhouse, but as I got closer, I realized it was sitting completely by itself. No neighboring houses, no nearby road, just a single home surrounded by open fields. The place immediately stood out, not because it looked abandoned, because it looked occupied, very occupied. Every room seemed lit, every curtain open, the entire house glowing in the darkness. Something about it felt wrong. I can't explain why. I kept driving. A few miles later, I reached a fork in the road. According to my GPS, I needed to turn left. The problem was the road no longer existed. There was supposed to be pavement. Instead, there was a locked gate and a chain. I checked the GPS again. Same route, same instruction. No signal, no recalculation, nothing. At that point, I decided to turn around. The nearest highway couldn't be that far away. As I retraced my route, I passed the illuminated house again. This time, something had changed. A vehicle sat in the driveway. I was almost certain it hadn't been there earlier. Maybe I missed it, maybe not. As I drove by, I glanced toward the house. Someone was standing in the front window, watching the road, watching me. I looked away immediately. A few minutes later, I checked my rearview mirror. Headlights appeared behind me. My stomach tightened. The road had been empty for nearly an hour. Now there was a vehicle. I told myself it was coincidence, probably somebody who lived nearby. But the headlights stayed behind me. Every turn, every curve, every mile. The vehicle never passed, never fell back, just followed. I tried convincing myself I was being paranoid. Then I made a turn I didn't need to make. The vehicle made the same turn. A few minutes later, I did it again. Same result. Now I knew. This wasn't coincidence. Someone was following me. My pulse immediately spiked. I accelerated. The vehicle accelerated. I slowed down. It slowed down, always keeping distance, always staying behind me. At one point, I considered stopping, maybe asking for directions. Thankfully, I didn't. Instead, I kept driving until I finally found a small gas station near a state highway. The moment the station came into view, I pulled in. The vehicle behind me continued straight without stopping. Gone within seconds. I sat in the parking lot for several minutes trying to calm down. Inside the station, I mentioned what happened to the clerk. I described the house, the location, the vehicle. The clerk became unusually quiet. Then he asked, "The big White House?" I nodded. He immediately knew which one I meant. Apparently, several travelers had reported similar experiences over the years. People getting lost. People being followed after passing the property. Nobody ever proved anything illegal was happening. No arrests, no investigations, just stories, lots of stories. The clerk told me locals avoided that road after dark. Not because they thought the house was haunted, because nobody trusted the people living there. I eventually made it home. But every now and then I think about that night, especially the person standing in the window, watching, waiting. The thing that bothers me most isn't being followed, it's the timing. The vehicle appeared only after I passed that house the second time. Maybe it was coincidence, maybe it wasn't. But if I ever find myself on that road again, I won't stop to find out. Because sometimes the most unsettling places aren't abandoned, they're occupied. And the people inside know you're there before you know they're watching. A few months ago, I was working a land survey job in western Montana. Most of the work involved hiking through remote areas, marking boundaries, documenting terrain, and checking locations that rarely saw human traffic. My supervisor had one rule he repeated constantly. If you find abandoned gear out there, leave it alone and report it. At the time, I thought it was excessive. People lose stuff in the woods all the time. Backpacks, phones, cameras. It didn't seem like a big deal. Then I found the camera, and I understood why that rule existed. It was late afternoon, and I was cutting through a heavily wooded ravine about 6 miles from the nearest road. The area wasn't part of any official trail system. Most people would never end up there by accident. As I crossed a fallen log, something caught my eye. A GoPro. It was sitting upright on a moss-covered stump. Not hidden, not damaged, just sitting there, almost like somebody had placed it carefully. The weird thing was how clean it looked. The surrounding area was muddy from recent rain, but the camera barely had a speck of dirt on it. I picked it up. That was my first mistake. When I got home that night, curiosity got the better of me. I connected it to my laptop. Most of the files were corrupted. The storage card showed dozens of damaged recordings. Eventually, I managed to recover one video. The timestamp showed it had been recorded only 4 days earlier. The footage began with a young woman hiking through dense forest. She seemed relaxed at first. She was talking to the camera about a camping trip. Nothing unusual. Then the video abruptly jumped forward. The woman wasn't hiking anymore. She was running, hard. The camera bounced violently as she pushed through branches and thick brush. Her breathing was frantic. At one point, she glanced behind her and whispered, "Oh my God, he's still there." The words immediately got my attention. The footage became even shakier. She kept looking over her shoulder. Several times she nearly tripped. Then she said something that made my stomach sink. I think he's been following me since yesterday. Not someone. Him. Like she'd already seen his face. The next few minutes were difficult to watch. She sounded exhausted, terrified. Every few seconds she would glance behind her. But whoever she was afraid of never appeared on camera. At least not yet. Eventually she stumbled. The camera flew from her hands and landed in the leaves. For several seconds, the lens pointed upward toward the trees. The woman was somewhere off screen. I could hear her crying. Then I heard another voice, a man's voice, calm, way too calm. He wasn't yelling. He wasn't running. He sounded like someone taking a casual walk. The woman immediately went silent. The camera continued recording. For a few seconds, nothing happened. Then a pair of boots entered the frame. Large hiking boots, mud-covered. The person stopped directly beside the camera. I remember leaning closer to my screen, waiting to see a face. But the camera never captured one, only the lower half of his body. He stood there motionless for several seconds, almost as if he was looking directly at the woman. Then I heard him speak, quietly, almost conversationally. "There you are." The woman started screaming. The camera shifted slightly, as if someone had nudged it. Then the recording ended, just like that. Black screen, no explanation, no conclusion, nothing. I sat there staring at my laptop for several minutes. I honestly didn't know what to think. Part of me wondered if it was staged, maybe some kind of student project, maybe a prank. But something about the woman's fear felt genuine. The way she spoke, the way she breathed, the panic in her voice. None of it sounded fake. The next morning, I contacted local authorities. I handed over the camera and gave them the exact coordinates where I'd found it. A detective called me a few days later. He asked several questions about the location. Then he told me something strange. There were no active missing person cases matching the woman in the video. None. No reports, no investigations, nothing. It was as if she didn't exist. The detective thanked me for turning the camera in and said they'd continue looking into it. That was the last update I ever received. Months passed. Eventually, I stopped thinking about it. Or at least I tried to. Then something happened. I was working in another remote area, about 40 miles away from where I found the camera. As I was packing equipment into my truck, I noticed a folded piece of paper tucked under one of my windshield wipers. At first, I assumed it was trash. Then I opened it. Inside was a single handwritten sentence. No reason to keep looking. No signature. No explanation. Nothing. Just those 5 words. The paper was dry, even though it had rained that morning. I looked around the parking area. Nobody was there. Maybe it was unrelated. Maybe it was a coincidence. That's what I told myself. But I never really believed it. I still work as a surveyor. I still spend time in remote places. But every now and then, I'll find myself looking over my shoulder for no reason. And whenever I see abandoned gear in the woods now, I don't touch it. I mark the location, I report it, and I keep walking. Because sometimes the most disturbing thing you can find in the wilderness isn't evidence of an animal. It's evidence that another person was there, and whatever happened to them was never explained. A few years ago, I worked for a utility company that inspected power lines running through remote parts of northern Idaho. Most days were uneventful. Drive to a location, inspect equipment, take photos, move on. One afternoon, I was checking a maintenance corridor that cut through a large wooded area several miles from the nearest highway. As I was walking back toward my truck, I noticed something lying near the base of a utility pole. It wasn't a camera, it was a memory card. Just a small SD card partially buried in the dirt. I almost ignored it, but for some reason, I picked it up and tossed it into my backpack. I figured maybe somebody dropped it while hiking. Maybe there were family photos on it. Maybe I could identify the owner. That night, after getting home, I inserted the card into my laptop. There were only 3 video files. The first one was completely normal. A guy filming a camping trip. Nothing unusual. The second video was strange. The camera was hidden inside a vehicle. Not mounted. Hidden. Almost like somebody had placed it between the seats without being noticed. The footage showed 2 men sitting in the front of a pickup truck. Neither of them seemed aware they were being recorded. At first I assumed it was some kind of prank. Then I started listening. The conversation immediately made me uncomfortable. They weren't talking like friends. They were arguing. One of them kept mentioning money. The other kept talking about the property. Then one of them said something that made me sit up straight. He said, "We can't leave him there forever." The truck went silent. The driver looked nervous. The passenger glanced toward the back seat. For the first time, I noticed something. There was someone else in the truck, a third person, partially visible, lying on the floor, not moving. I remember feeling a knot form in my stomach. The video ended abruptly. I immediately opened the final file. The footage was darker. It looked like it had been recorded later that same night. The camera was still hidden inside the vehicle. The truck appeared parked somewhere remote. The two men got out. The driver opened the rear door. Then both men dragged the third person out. I couldn't see everything clearly, but I could see enough. The person wasn't walking. They were being carried. One of the men shined a flashlight toward the woods. The other said, "Hurry up." Then the camera shifted slightly. For a split second, the flashlight beam swept across the hidden camera. The driver noticed it. Everything stopped. I still remember his expression. Confusion, then realization. He walked directly toward the lens. The footage ended, just black. I sat there staring at my laptop. The whole thing felt wrong. Maybe it was staged, maybe it wasn't. But I wasn't willing to take that chance. The next morning, I contacted police and handed over the memory card. An investigator interviewed me later that week. I expected them to tell me it was fake. Instead, they asked a lot of questions, mostly about where I found it. Weeks passed, then months. Eventually, I assumed nothing had come from it. Until one evening, I returned home from work and noticed an unfamiliar truck parked across the street from my apartment. Nothing unusual at first. People parked there all the time. But the truck remained there the next day, and the day after that. Always occupied, always running. The driver never got out, never approached me, just sat there, watching. Eventually, I reported it. Police checked the vehicle. By the time they arrived, it was gone. I never saw it again. About a year later, I searched online for updates on the case. I couldn't find much. Just a brief local article mentioning an investigation connected to a remote property outside town. No names, no arrests, no details. Maybe it was unrelated. Maybe the footage was fake. But every now and then, I think back to that last frame. The moment the driver realized he was being recorded. The look on his face wasn't anger. It wasn't panic. It was concern, like he wasn't worried about what I'd seen. He was worried about who might see it next. And sometimes I wonder if finding that memory card wasn't an accident at all. Maybe somebody dropped it intentionally. Maybe it was the only chance they had to get evidence out. Either way, I learned something from that experience. If you find random electronics in the middle of nowhere, sometimes they weren't lost. Sometimes they were left behind for a reason. A few summers ago, I worked as a seasonal fire lookout in a remote section of Oregon. If you've never seen one of those towers, they're basically small cabins built on top of tall steel structures overlooking miles of forest. You're completely alone. No neighbors, no nearby roads, no backup, just you in the woods. Before my first shift, an older ranger spent a day training me. He'd worked those towers for almost 30 years. Most of his advice was practical. Watch for lightning strikes, monitor radio traffic, keep emergency supplies stocked. But before he left, he gave me one strange rule. If somebody comes to the tower after dark, don't open the hatch. I laughed. Honestly, it sounded ridiculous. The tower sat miles away from any trail. Who was going to climb all those stairs in the middle of the night? The ranger didn't laugh. He just said, "Trust me, if someone really needs help, they'll still be there in the morning." Then he left. About 3 weeks later, I understood exactly why he said it. A major storm rolled through one evening. Heavy rain, strong winds, constant lightning. Visibility dropped to almost nothing. By midnight, the forest below looked like a black ocean. I was reading a book when the radio wave briefly lost signal. Not unusual during storms. Still, it left me feeling isolated. Around 2 a.m., I heard something. At first, I thought it was rain hitting the stairs. Then I realized it had a rhythm. Clang, 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 footsteps. Somebody was climbing the tower. I froze. The sound continued steadily upward. The tower was nearly 50 feet tall. Whoever it was had already climbed most of the way. My first thought was that maybe a hiker was in trouble. Maybe somebody got lost during the storm. But then I remembered something. There were no public trails anywhere near that tower. You had to know exactly where it was. The footsteps finally stopped outside the trapdoor beneath the cabin. Silence. Then came a knock. 3 slow knocks. I didn't respond. A few seconds later, a voice called out, "Hey." My stomach dropped. The voice sounded familiar. Very familiar. Then it said my name. Not just my first name, my full name. I sat up immediately. Nobody working in that district knew me very well. I had only been there a few weeks. The voice called out again. This time it sounded even more familiar. It reminded me of my older brother. Not exactly, but close enough to make me uncomfortable. The man outside spoke calmly. "Open up, man. I'm soaked." I walked quietly toward the hatch, but stayed several feet away. Something felt wrong. The voice wasn't pleading. It wasn't desperate. It sounded rehearsed, almost like somebody reading from a script. I asked who he was. There was a brief pause. Then he said, "You know who I am." That answer immediately set off alarms in my head. If somebody genuinely needed help, they would tell you who they were. The man knocked again, harder this time. "I've been climbing for 20 minutes. Just let me in." I still didn't move. Then he said something that made my blood run cold. He mentioned the town where I grew up, a town nearly 1,000 miles away. Somehow this stranger knew details about me. Details he shouldn't know. At that point, I grabbed my radio and tried contacting another ranger station. No signal. The storm was interfering again. The knocking continued. Every few minutes, the man would speak. Sometimes he'd sound friendly, sometimes irritated, sometimes almost angry. But one thing never changed. He refused to identify himself. Hours passed. I stayed awake the entire night. Around 4 a.m. I heard something strange, a faint electronic sound, almost like audio playing through a speaker. Then the voice started again. This time it sounded different, less natural, more mechanical. And that's when I finally realized what was happening. The man wasn't improvising. He was playing recordings. Recordings of conversations. Recordings that included my name. Maybe from social media, maybe from videos, maybe from somewhere else. I don't know. But once I noticed it, I couldn't unhear it. The pauses felt wrong. The tone felt wrong, like clips stitched together. Whoever was outside had done research, a lot of research. That realization scared me more than anything else, because it meant this wasn't random. He had chosen me. Sometime after sunrise, the knocking stopped. The storm finally began clearing. I waited another hour before looking outside. The stairs were empty. Nobody was there. But there were muddy boot prints all over the landing. Fresh prints. There was also something else. A small portable speaker. It had been left near the trapdoor. When I picked it up, I found a memory card inside. The card contained dozens of short audio clips. My name, my hometown, names of family members. Bits of information taken from social media posts I'd made years earlier. The guy had spent time collecting information about me. Enough information to sound familiar. Enough information to gain trust. Enough information to make me open that hatch. I immediately reported everything. Law enforcement searched the area. They never found him. What made things worse was learning I wasn't the first person. A few other isolated workers in the region had reported similar incidents over the years. Unknown people approaching remote locations, using personal information, trying to convince victims to let them inside. Nobody knows whether it was the same individual or several different people. All I know is this. If I had opened that hatch that night, nobody would have heard me scream. And in a place that remote, nobody would have found me for days. I finished the season, but I never worked another lookout tower after that. Because sometimes the scariest thing in the wilderness isn't being alone. It's realizing somebody knows exactly who you are. For almost 12 years, I restored antique furniture and collectibles in a small town in Maine. Most jobs were straightforward. Clean an item, repair damage, return it to the owner. Occasionally, I'd work on estate sale pieces where nobody knew much about their history. That's exactly how I ended up with the doll. A woman brought it into my workshop one afternoon. She said it had belonged to her grandmother. The family was cleaning out an old house and wanted the doll restored before selling it. At first glance, it wasn't unusual. Just an old porcelain doll from the early 1900s. Cracked face, faded clothing, missing paint. I'd worked on dozens like it before. I accepted the job without hesitation. That decision still bothers me. The first strange thing happened while I was documenting the item. Part of my process involves photographing every piece before restoration. As I was examining the doll, I noticed the back panel seemed loose. Many antique dolls have small compartments for repairs, so I carefully removed it. Inside was a folded piece of paper. I assumed it was some kind of manufacturer information. Instead, it was a photograph of a young girl holding the doll. Nothing unusual, until I flipped it over. Written on the back was a date from the 1970s, along with a full name and home address. I thought it was interesting, but not particularly important. I placed everything aside and continued working. A few days later, I received an email. No subject line, no message, just an attachment. The attachment was the exact photograph I'd found inside the doll. Same girl, same image. My stomach immediately tightened. I hadn't posted that photo online. I hadn't shown it to anyone. Only 2 people knew it existed. Me and the client. I contacted the client. She insisted she hadn't sent anything. I believed her. She sounded genuinely confused. At first, I assumed someone had somehow gained access to my workshop files. Maybe a hacker, maybe a coincidence. Then another email arrived. This time there was a message. It simply said, "Please don't sell her." Nothing else, no signature, no explanation. I responded asking who they were. No reply. Over the next week, more emails arrived, always from different addresses, always referencing details about the doll that nobody should have known. One message described damage hidden underneath the clothing, damage I had only discovered during restoration. Another mentioned the exact shelf where I stored it. That one really got my attention because it suggested someone had either been inside my workshop or watching it. I installed additional security cameras. For several days, nothing happened. Then one morning, I reviewed footage from the previous night. At around 2:40 a.m., a person approached the front window. They didn't try to enter, didn't vandalize anything. They simply stood there looking in, watching. The camera angle wasn't good enough to identify them, but they remained there for nearly 20 minutes, completely motionless. A few nights later, it happened again. Same person, same behavior, just standing outside, looking directly at the doll. At that point, I contacted police. They took a report but had little to work with. No clear face, no license plate, no identification. Meanwhile, the emails continued. The final message arrived about 3 weeks later. It read, "She was never supposed to leave the family." That message led investigators in a completely different direction. Eventually, they discovered the doll had been stolen decades earlier during a family dispute involving an inheritance. Several relatives had spent years trying to track down items taken from the estate. One family member in particular had become obsessed with recovering them. According to police, he had spent years locating and monitoring various heirlooms. The doll was simply the latest one. Authorities eventually identified the individual and issued a restraining order. Nothing violent ever happened, but that doesn't mean it wasn't terrifying. The thing that still bothers me is how much he knew. He knew where the doll was. He knew where I worked. He knew details he should never have had access to. After that case, I changed the way I handled restoration projects. If I find personal documents hidden inside antiques now, I report them immediately. Because sometimes the value of an object isn't money. Sometimes it's the people attached to it. And people can be a lot harder to get rid of than ghosts. A few years ago, I worked as a night manager at a 24-hour convenience store in rural Arizona. The store sat just off a highway exit about 20 miles from the nearest town. Most overnight shifts were boring. A few truckers, a few travelers, maybe the occasional local, nothing exciting. I worked 6 nights a week, usually from 10 p.m. until 6 a.m. After a few months, the routine became automatic. Stock shelves, clean counters, count inventory, watch the clock, go home. Then came the shift that made me quit. It started normally enough. Around midnight, a man entered the store and bought a bottle of water. Nothing unusual. Mid-30s, baseball cap, dark hoodie. I barely paid attention. About an hour later, he came back. Same guy. This time he bought a candy bar. Again, nothing strange. People stopped multiple times during road trips. But then he returned again, and again, and again. By 4 a.m., he'd entered the store 5 separate times. Each visit was only a few minutes. Each purchase was something small. Water, gum, coffee, chips. The weird part wasn't that he kept coming back. The weird part was that he never seemed to leave. Every time I looked outside, his vehicle was parked in a different part of the lot. Sometimes near the pumps, Sometimes near the dumpsters, sometimes near the far edge of the property. Always there, always watching. At one point I joked, "Can't decide what you want?" He smiled. Not a friendly smile, just enough to acknowledge the comment. Then he said, "Just killing time." Something about the way he said it bothered me. The shift dragged on. Around 5 I started noticing something else. Several unfamiliar vehicles had entered the parking lot. Not customers. They weren't using pumps. They weren't entering the store. They just parked. Different areas, different vehicles, waiting. I counted 4, then 5, then 6, all occupied, none doing anything. My stomach started tightening. I pulled up the exterior security cameras. Every vehicle had a clear view of the building. That didn't feel random. A little after 5:30, the man returned. Same hoodie, same calm expression. This time he bought nothing. He walked directly to the counter and asked, "What time does your replacement arrive?" The question immediately raised every alarm in my head. I lied. I told him another employee would arrive in 15 minutes. In reality, I worked alone until opening. The man nodded, then left. The moment he exited, I locked the front door. Company policy said I wasn't supposed to. I didn't care. Something felt wrong, very wrong. A few minutes later, one of the parked vehicles pulled closer. Then another, all slowly repositioning around the store. At that point, I called the county sheriff's office. I explained everything. The dispatcher took it seriously immediately. Apparently, several businesses in neighboring counties had reported similar incidents. Groups would scout stores during overnight hours, identify lone employees, wait until shift changes or opening times, then commit robberies. Sometimes worse. Deputies arrived about 20 minutes later. The vehicles left before officers reached the store. Every single one, including the man in the hoodie, like somebody had warned them. Police reviewed security footage and collected descriptions. Unfortunately, nothing ever came from it. No arrests, no identification, nothing. But one deputy told me something I still remember. He said, "The guy wasn't shopping, he was timing you." That explanation made everything click. The repeated visits, the questions, the parked vehicles, the waiting, the observation. The entire night wasn't random. It was preparation. I finished my shift that morning, technically, but mentally, it felt like I never left. For weeks afterward, I couldn't stop replaying every interaction in my head, every smile, every question, every time that guy walked through the door. Because what scared me wasn't what happened. It was how close they might have been to doing something much worse. A month later, I transferred to a daytime position. Eventually, I left the company entirely. To this day, whenever I stop at a convenience store late at night, I pay attention to who's hanging around outside. Not the customers, the people pretending to be customers. Because sometimes the most dangerous part of a night shift isn't being alone. It's realizing someone else has been watching you the entire time, waiting for the right moment. We're about halfway through tonight's compilation. If you're enjoying the stories so far, and want more realistic horror like this every week, consider subscribing and turning on notifications. It really helps support the channel and lets me keep bringing you longer compilations like this. 1. Now let's head back into the darkness. A few years ago, I rented an apartment in a small 3-story building outside Pittsburgh. The rent was suspiciously cheap. At the time, I didn't ask questions. I was working nights and needed somewhere affordable. The building wasn't great, but it was quiet, or at least it seemed quiet at first. The landlord was an older guy who lived nearby. During the lease signing, he only gave me one unusual rule. He pointed toward a locked door at the end of the first-floor hallway and said, "Whatever you do, don't go into the basement." I laughed. I assumed it was because of maintenance equipment or old pipes. But he didn't laugh back. He simply repeated, "Seriously, stay out of the basement." The conversation felt strange, but I didn't think much of it. For the first few weeks, everything was normal. Then I started hearing noises, usually around 2 or 3 in the morning. The sounds always came from below. Heavy footsteps, doors opening and closing. Occasionally what sounded like furniture being moved. At first I assumed another tenant had access. But after talking to my neighbors, I learned nobody used the basement. Nobody. The door remained locked at all times. That answer should have reassured me. Instead, it made me more curious. One night after work, I came home around 1:30 a.m. As I entered the building, I immediately noticed something strange. The basement door was slightly open, only a few inches, just enough to reveal darkness beyond it. I stopped walking. For weeks, I'd only ever seen that door locked. Now it was open. I told myself to ignore it, go upstairs, get some sleep, but curiosity got the better of me. I pulled out my phone and walked toward the door. The smell hit me first. Stale air, mold, and something else. Food. Fresh food. The kind of smell you get when someone has been living somewhere. I slowly pushed the door open. A set of concrete stairs disappeared into the darkness. At the bottom, I could see a faint light, not bright, just enough to suggest someone was down there. My pulse immediately sped up. The landlord had told me nobody used the basement. So who turned the light on? I should have left right then. Instead, I walked downstairs. Every step felt louder than the last. The basement was much larger than I expected. Several storage rooms lined the walls. Most were empty. But near the back, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. A mattress, then another, then another. There were blankets, food containers, bottled water, extension cords. It looked like somebody had built a small living space underground. I stood there trying to process what I was seeing. Then I heard a cough, not from upstairs, not from outside, from somewhere deeper in the basement. A human cough, close, very close. Every hair on my body stood up. I turned off my phone flashlight instantly. The basement fell into darkness. I listened, silence, then slow footsteps, moving toward me. At that moment, all curiosity disappeared. I didn't care who was down there, I just wanted out. I quietly backed toward the stairs. The footsteps continued, slow, deliberate, like whoever it was knew I was there. I reached the staircase and started climbing. Halfway up, I heard a voice behind me, a man's voice. Calm, almost amused. He said, "You're not supposed to be down here." I ran. I sprinted up the stairs, slammed the basement door, and practically launched myself into my apartment. I locked every lock I had. Then I called police. When officers arrived, they searched the basement. What they found was disturbing. Several people had apparently been living there. Not tenants, not family, just people. Some homeless, some with outstanding warrants. According to police, the landlord had been secretly allowing them to stay in the basement in exchange for odd jobs and cash, completely illegal. Nobody living in the building had been informed. The officers eventually located 3 individuals downstairs. The man who spoke to me was one of them. The landlord was later charged with multiple housing violations. I moved out less than 2 weeks later. The part that still bothers me isn't that people were living there. It's how close they were. For months, I'd been sleeping directly above a hidden basement community I never knew existed. Listening to footsteps, hearing doors, wondering what was making the noise. And the entire time, my landlord knew exactly what was down there. That's why he didn't want anyone opening that door. Not because of monsters, not because the place was haunted, because the truth was much worse. It was real. Back in 2021, I moved into an apartment complex outside Dallas, Texas. The place wasn't luxury by any means, but it was decent. The rent was affordable. The area felt safe, and most importantly, it was close to work. One thing the complex took seriously was parking. Every tenant received an assigned space. Mine was space 117. The number was painted directly onto the pavement. Management constantly reminded residents not to park in spots that weren't theirs. At first, everything was normal. For almost a year, I never had a single issue. Then one Monday morning, I walked outside for work and found a dark gray sedan parked in my space. I was annoyed, but not worried. People make mistakes. I parked in visitor parking and left a note on the windshield. Nothing aggressive, just explaining that the spot was assigned. When I got home later that evening, the sedan was gone. Problem solved, or so I thought. About a week later, it happened again. Same sedan, same spot. This time I reported it to management. They said they'd leave a warning notice. The next day, the vehicle disappeared again. At that point, I assumed it was over. Then it started happening every few days. Always the same car. Always my spot. Never anyone else's. The pattern was strange. The sedan would appear for a day or two, then vanish for several days, then return. Nobody seemed to know who owned it. Eventually, I started paying more attention. The vehicle had heavily tinted windows, no parking permit, no identifying stickers. Nothing unusual, but enough to make it difficult to identify. One evening, I got home earlier than normal. Usually I arrived around 6 p.m., That day I arrived shortly after 3. The sedan was already there, and for the first time, someone was inside. A man sat behind the wheel, maybe late 30s, baseball cap, sunglasses. Despite the fact that it was cloudy outside, he wasn't using a phone, wasn't reading, wasn't eating. He was simply sitting there, looking toward the apartment buildings. The moment he noticed me walking toward the space, he started the car and drove away. No hesitation, just left. That immediately bothered me. Most people would explain themselves, apologize, say they were waiting for someone. This guy did none of those things. He acted like he didn't want to be seen. Over the following month, I started noticing the sedan in other locations around the complex, near the mailboxes, across from the gym, along the back fence, always parked, always occupied, and always facing toward residential buildings. The driver never got out, at least not when I saw him. One Saturday morning, I decided to document everything. Every sighting, every date, every time the sedan appeared. At first I thought I was overreacting. Then I noticed something unsettling. The car only showed up when I was home. Never when I worked late. Never when I spent weekends away. Only when my vehicle was present. I didn't know what that meant, but I knew I didn't like it. A few weeks later, I left town for 3 days to visit family. When I returned, I checked security footage from a camera I'd recently installed near my front door. The camera hadn't captured the sedan once during my absence, not a single appearance. The following evening, it returned, parked directly across from my building. That was the moment I stopped believing it was coincidence. I contacted management again. This time I showed them photos, dates, times, everything I'd documented. They agreed the situation was unusual and provided footage from several parking lot cameras. Reviewing it made things worse. The sedan wasn't just parking randomly. It was moving around the property throughout the day, different locations, different angles, always maintaining a view of my section of the complex. My stomach dropped. I still couldn't prove the driver was watching me specifically, but it certainly looked that way. Management contacted local police. An officer reviewed the information and agreed to run the license plate. I expected nothing to come of it. Instead, I got a phone call 2 days later. The plate belonged to a stolen vehicle. The registration was fraudulent. The car shouldn't have been there at all. That immediately escalated things. Police increased patrols around the area. Meanwhile, I became hyper-aware of everything. Every unfamiliar vehicle, every stranger, every noise outside my apartment. Sleep became difficult. Even simple errands felt different. I started checking mirrors while driving, checking parking lots before getting out of my car. The anxiety was exhausting. Then, almost as suddenly as it began, the sedan disappeared. No sightings, no reports, nothing. Days passed, then weeks. The vehicle was gone. Police never located it, at least not while I lived there. Eventually, life returned to normal, or something close to normal. A few months later, an officer called with an update. Apparently, similar reports had surfaced at several apartment complexes throughout the area. Different vehicles, same behavior. Drivers spending long periods watching residential properties. Nobody knew whether they were targeting specific individuals or simply collecting information. The investigations never produced definitive answers. To this day, I don't know if the driver was watching me. Maybe I was just one apartment among many. Maybe I happened to notice something others didn't. Or maybe I was exactly who he was interested in. I'll never know. What bothers me most is how ordinary it all looked. There was no dramatic confrontation, no threatening messages, no obvious crime. Just a man sitting in a car, watching, waiting, doing something that seemed harmless until you looked closely. And sometimes that's what scares me most. Not the threats you can clearly see, the ones you can't explain. Because if someone spends months quietly observing your routine, there's a reason. And not knowing that reason is often worse than knowing it. Back in 2021, I moved into an apartment complex outside Dallas, Texas. The place wasn't luxury by any means, but it was decent. The rent was affordable. The area felt safe, and most importantly, it was close to work. One thing the complex took seriously was parking. Every tenant received an assigned space. Mine was space 117. The number was painted directly onto the pavement. Management constantly reminded residents not to park in spots that weren't theirs. At first, everything was normal. For almost a year, I never had a single issue. Then one Monday morning, I walked outside for work and found a dark gray sedan parked in my space. I was annoyed, but not worried. People make mistakes. I parked in visitor parking and left a note on the windshield. Nothing aggressive, just explaining that the spot was assigned. When I got home later that evening, the sedan was gone. Problem solved, or so I thought. About a week later, it happened again. Same sedan, same spot. This time I reported it to management. They said they'd leave a warning notice. The next day, the vehicle disappeared again. At that point, I assumed it was over. Then it started happening every few days. Always the same car. Always my spot. Never anyone else's. The pattern was strange. The sedan would appear for a day or two, then vanish for several days, then return. Nobody seemed to know who owned it. Eventually, I started paying more attention. The vehicle had heavily tinted windows. No parking permit. No identifying stickers. Nothing unusual, but enough to make it difficult to identify. One evening, I got home earlier than normal. Usually I arrived around 6 p.m. That day I arrived shortly after 3. The sedan was already there, and for the first time, someone was inside. A man sat behind the wheel, maybe late 30s, baseball cap, sunglasses. Despite the fact that it was cloudy outside, he wasn't using a phone, wasn't reading, wasn't eating. He was simply sitting there, looking toward the apartment buildings. The moment he noticed me walking toward the space, he started the car and drove away. No hesitation, just left. That immediately bothered me. Most people would explain themselves, apologize, say they were waiting for someone. This guy did none of those things. He acted like he didn't want to be seen. Over the following month, I started noticing the sedan in other locations around the complex, near the mailboxes, across from the gym, along the back fence, always parked, always occupied, and always facing toward residential buildings. The driver never got out, at least not when I saw him. One Saturday morning, I decided to document everything. Every sighting, every date, every time the sedan appeared. At first I thought I was overreacting. Then I noticed something unsettling. The car only showed up when I was home. Never when I worked late. Never when I spent weekends away. Only when my vehicle was present. I didn't know what that meant, but I knew I didn't like it. A few weeks later, I left town for 3 days to visit family. When I returned, I checked security footage from a camera I'd recently installed near my front door. The camera hadn't captured the sedan once during my absence. Not a single appearance. The following evening, it returned, parked directly across from my building. That was the moment I stopped believing it was coincidence. I contacted management again. This time I showed them photos, dates, times, everything I'd documented. They agreed the situation was unusual and provided footage from several parking lot cameras. Reviewing it made things worse. The sedan wasn't just parking randomly. It was moving around the property throughout the day, different locations, different angles, always maintaining a view of my section of the complex. My stomach dropped. I still couldn't prove the driver was watching me specifically, but it certainly looked that way. Management contacted local police. An officer reviewed the information and agreed to run the license plate. I expected nothing to come of it. Instead, I got a phone call 2 days later. The plate belonged to a stolen vehicle. The registration was fraudulent. The car shouldn't have been there at all. That immediately escalated things. Police increased patrols around the area. Meanwhile, I became hyper-aware of everything. Every unfamiliar vehicle, every stranger, every noise outside my apartment. Sleep became difficult. Even simple errands felt different. I started checking mirrors while driving, checking parking lots before getting out of my car. The anxiety was exhausting. Then, almost as suddenly as it began, the sedan disappeared. No sightings, no reports, nothing. Days passed, then weeks. The vehicle was gone. Police never located it, at least not while I lived there. Eventually, life returned to normal, or something close to normal. A few months later, an officer called with an update. Apparently, similar reports had surfaced at several apartment complexes throughout the area. Different vehicles, same behavior. Drivers spending long periods watching residential properties. Nobody knew whether they were targeting specific individuals or simply collecting information. The investigations never produced definitive answers. To this day, I don't know if the driver was watching me. Maybe I was just one apartment among many. Maybe I happened to notice something others didn't. Or maybe I was exactly who he was interested in. I'll never know. What bothers me most is how ordinary it all looked. There was no dramatic confrontation, no threatening messages, no obvious crime. Just a man sitting in a car, watching, waiting, doing something that seemed harmless until you looked closely. And sometimes that's what scares me most. Not the threats you can clearly see, the ones you can't explain. Because if someone spends months quietly observing your routine, there's a reason. And not knowing that reason is often worse than knowing it. Back in 2022, I worked as a night auditor at a small hotel outside Nashville. If you've never worked night audit, it's basically the graveyard shift for hotels. Most of your time is spent handling paperwork, answering occasional phone calls, and trying not to fall asleep between midnight and sunrise. The hotel itself wasn't anything special. 3 floors, about 80 rooms, mostly business travelers and people passing through on road trips. The story happened on a Tuesday night, around 3:30 a.m. The lobby was completely empty. I was sitting behind the front desk, finishing reports when the front doors opened. A man walked in. Immediately, something about him felt off. Not dangerous, just unusual. He looked like he'd been driving for a long time. Wrinkled clothes, no luggage, no backpack, nothing. Just car keys in one hand. Most travelers carry something. This guy didn't. He walked directly to the counter. No greeting, no small talk. The first thing he said was, "I need room 404. That caught my attention immediately. Room 404 wasn't available. In fact, it hadn't been available for months. There had been a major plumbing issue earlier that year that damaged part of the 4th floor hallway. Several rooms were closed during repairs. Room 404 was one of them. I apologized and offered him another room. He didn't react, he just repeated, "I need room 404. Same tone, same expression, like he hadn't heard me. I explained again that the room wasn't operational. For several seconds, he just stared at me. Then he asked, "Who has access to it?" That question immediately made me uncomfortable. I told him maintenance staff had access, nobody else. Again, he simply nodded. Then he asked another strange question. "Is it occupied?" I told him no, the room was empty. The man thought about that for a moment, then smiled. Not a friendly smile, more like he had confirmed something. Without another word, he turned around and left. I remember watching him walk through the parking lot. He got into a dark sedan and drove away, or at least I thought he did. About an hour later, I was doing routine checks through security cameras. That's when I noticed movement on the 4th floor, the closed section. At first, I assumed it was maintenance. Then I remembered maintenance wasn't scheduled overnight. I zoomed in. Someone was standing outside room 404. My stomach dropped. The person looked exactly like the man from the lobby. I checked the parking lot cameras. His sedan was gone, or at least the one I'd seen leave. So how was he upstairs? I immediately grabbed the master key and called hotel security. The hotel only had one overnight security officer. We went upstairs together. As we approached the closed hallway, we heard movement, fast movement, like somebody running. The hallway was supposed to be empty. When we reached room 404, the door stood slightly open. Security entered first. The room was empty. No guest, no belongings, nothing, at first. Then we noticed something. The bathroom ceiling panel had been removed. Above it was access space, connected to several neighboring rooms, large enough for someone to move through. Someone had been using maintenance access routes to enter closed areas of the hotel. Security immediately called police. The investigation uncovered something much bigger. Over the following weeks, management discovered evidence that an unknown person had been entering vacant rooms after hours. Food wrappers, water bottles, blankets, even stolen guest information taken from discarded paperwork. Whoever it was knew the building extremely well. Police believed the individual had likely been accessing hotels across multiple states using maintenance routes and unused rooms. The man was never identified, at least not while I worked there. But here's the part that still bothers me. When investigators reviewed security footage from earlier that night, they found something I hadn't noticed. The man wasn't looking at me while asking about room 404. He was looking past me, directly at the wall containing the emergency key cabinet, the cabinet that controlled access to every room in the hotel. I quit less than 2 months later, not because I was scared of ghosts, not because the hotel was haunted, because I realized somebody had walked into that lobby already knowing exactly what they were looking for. And sometimes the guests you should worry about aren't the ones checking in. They're the ones who were already inside before they arrived. During my second year of college, I worked part-time at a storage facility outside Kansas City. The job was simple: open the office, process payments, answer customer questions, and occasionally help prepare units for auction when renters stopped paying. Most days were incredibly boring, which is why one particular unit stood out: Unit 314. At first, there was nothing unusual about it. It was a standard 10 by 20 storage unit near the back of the property. The renter always paid on time, usually 6 months in advance, always cash, always through the mail, no phone calls, no visits, no contact whatsoever. At first, nobody cared. Some customers barely interacted with us. It wasn't unusual, but after a couple years, people started noticing something strange. Nobody had ever seen the renter, not once. The facility manager had worked there for almost 5 years. He'd never met the person. Neither had the assistant manager. Neither had the previous owner. Every payment arrived exactly on time. Every form was completed correctly. Yet nobody had ever seen the individual connected to Unit 314. It became one of those weird workplace mysteries. Whenever new employees started, someone would eventually point at the unit and say, "That's the one nobody's ever opened." Most people assumed it contained furniture, family belongings, old business inventory, something boring. The years passed, nothing changed. Then one winter, the payments stopped. At first, nobody worried. People forget, life happens. But one missed payment became 2, then 3. Eventually, the legal process began. Certified letters were sent, no response. Phone numbers on file were disconnected. The listed address didn't exist. Everything connected to the account started falling apart. The deeper management looked, the stranger things became. The identification used to rent the unit couldn't be verified. The address was fake. The emergency contact was fake. Almost every piece of information attached to the account appeared fabricated. For the first time, people became genuinely curious about what was inside. After several months, the lien process was completed. The unit could legally be opened. I remember the day clearly. There were 4 of us standing outside: the facility manager, an assistant manager, another employee, and me. Everyone expected something anticlimactic. Maybe old furniture, maybe boxes, maybe nothing at all. The manager cut the lock, rolled up the door, and nobody said a word. At first glance, the unit looked empty. Not completely empty, just strangely organized. Rows of identical cardboard boxes lined the walls. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, everything carefully arranged, almost like a warehouse. The manager stepped inside and opened one of the boxes. That's when the atmosphere changed. Inside were photographs, thousands of photographs. Not family pictures, not vacation photos. Strangers, complete strangers, walking through parking lots, leaving grocery stores, entering office buildings, getting gas, sitting at outdoor restaurants, just ordinary people. The photos were organized into folders: dates, locations, names, vehicle descriptions, detailed observations. The deeper we looked, the more disturbing it became. Some folders contained hundreds of photographs focused on a single individual. Different days, different locations, different years. Almost like someone had been tracking them. The manager immediately stopped the inspection and called police. Investigators arrived later that afternoon. At first, they assumed private investigator work, maybe surveillance records. But that explanation didn't last long. Many of the people in the photographs had no connection to one another. Different cities, different states, different backgrounds, no clear pattern, no obvious purpose. Then officers discovered the notebooks. There were dozens of them, each containing detailed observations, daily routines, work schedules, descriptions of vehicles, favorite restaurants, walking routes, information nobody should reasonably know about strangers. The entire unit felt less like storage and more like an archive, a record of people being watched. For reasons nobody could explain, the investigation lasted months. Eventually, federal agencies became involved, not because of any specific crime, because nobody could determine why the material existed. Investigators managed to identify some of the people appearing in the photographs. Most had never noticed they were being observed. Many had lived normal lives completely unaware somebody had been documenting them. The most disturbing discovery came later. Several photographs were recent, very recent, only weeks old. That meant whoever maintained the collection had been active shortly before the payments stopped. The person hadn't disappeared years earlier. They'd vanished recently. Police worked backward through payment records, postmarks, financial transactions, anything. Nothing led to a real identity. The renter essentially didn't exist, at least on paper. Every lead ended with another fake name, another false address, another dead end. Over time, the investigation faded from public attention. No arrests, no major breakthroughs, just unanswered questions. A year later, I transferred to another job. Life moved on, for the most part. Then something happened that brought everything back. One evening, I was scrolling through social media when I recognized a photograph. Not the exact photo, the location. It was a coffee shop in Kansas City. The image had been posted by a local business page. In the background, partially visible near a window, sat a man. The same man investigators believed had rented Unit 314. I recognized him from surveillance stills shown during the investigation. I immediately contacted authorities. Unfortunately, the lead went nowhere. The image quality wasn't good enough for identification, and by then years had passed. To this day, nobody knows who rented that unit. Nobody knows why they spent years documenting strangers. And nobody knows where they went. What sticks with me most isn't the mystery itself. It's how ordinary everything looked. From the outside, Unit 314 was just another storage space. A metal door, a lock, a number painted on the wall. People walked past it every day without thinking twice. Meanwhile, behind that door sat thousands of photographs documenting the lives of people who had no idea they were being watched. And every time I drive past a storage facility now, I think about that unit. Because sometimes the strangest secrets aren't hidden underground or inside abandoned buildings. They're sitting in plain sight, locked behind a door nobody ever thinks to open. We're in the final stretch now. The next fewer stories are some of the most unsettling in tonight's compilation, and honestly, a few of them stayed with me long after I finished reading them. Before we continue, check out the pinned comment below and let me know your answer to tonight's question. And if you've made it this far, you're part of a very small percentage of viewers who actually finish these long compilations. Let's finish strong. A few years ago, I was working long shifts at a hospital in Chicago. Most weeks I was putting in 60 to 70 hours. I lived alone in a small apartment near downtown. And honestly, I spent so little time there that it mostly felt like a place to sleep. Because I was constantly exhausted, I didn't pay much attention to small things. At first, the weird stuff started gradually. I'd come home and find a kitchen cabinet open. Nothing dramatic, just slightly open. Sometimes I'd notice a chair that seemed a few inches out of place. Other times, food would disappear faster than expected. I always had an explanation. I forgot. I was tired. I moved it myself. Looking back, I wish I'd trusted my instincts, because deep down, I knew something wasn't right. The first thing that genuinely bothered me happened on a Thursday. I came home after an overnight shift and found my bathroom light on. I clearly remembered turning it off before leaving. I stood there staring at it for several seconds. Then I convinced myself I was imagining things. That's the scary part. When strange things happen in your own home, your brain works overtime trying to explain them away. Over the next few weeks, the incidents became more frequent. My cereal boxes would be moved. A blanket I kept folded on the couch would be unfolded. Items would disappear and reappear days later. Nothing valuable was ever taken, which somehow made it worse. It felt personal, like somebody was touching things simply because they could. One Saturday, my shift ended unexpectedly early. Instead of getting home around midnight, I arrived shortly after 2 p.m. The moment I opened the apartment door, I noticed an unfamiliar smell. Not strong, just strange. A mix of dust, sweat, and stale air. The apartment felt occupied. I know that sounds ridiculous, but that's the only way I can describe it. Occupied. I walked into the bedroom and immediately froze. The ceiling access panel above my closet was slightly open, only a few inches, but I knew it had been closed. I'd noticed it dozens of times before. My pulse immediately sped up. I stood there trying to convince myself there was a reasonable explanation. Maintenance, a loose hinge, anything, but none of those explanations made sense. I grabbed a flashlight from my kitchen drawer and dragged a chair into the bedroom. Every step felt heavier than the last. When I climbed onto the chair and pushed the access panel upward, I expected to find insulation, dust, maybe a squirrel. Instead, I found a face, a human face, staring directly at me. For a second, neither of us moved. I don't think my brain fully understood what I was seeing. It was a man, dirty, unshaven, completely still, just watching me. Then he blinked, and suddenly reality caught up. I nearly fell off the chair. I scrambled backward and hit the floor hard. The man immediately disappeared deeper into the crawl space. I grabbed my phone and ran. Not walked, ran. I didn't stop until I reached the street. The 911 operator probably thought I was having a panic attack. Honestly, I might have been. Police arrived within minutes. When they searched the crawl space, they discovered the man had been living there for weeks. Maybe longer. They found food, water, blankets, phone chargers, batteries, and things that still make my skin crawl. Photos, dozens of photos. Most were taken while I was asleep. Some had clearly been taken from the edge of my bed, others from the bedroom doorway. There were even photos taken while I watched television in the living room. The investigators believed he had been coming down into the apartment while I was at work, using my bathroom, eating my food, watching me, learning my routine. The thought of that still makes me feel sick. The man was eventually arrested. According to police, he'd been moving between apartment buildings for years. He specifically targeted tenants who worked long hours and lived alone. People who wouldn't immediately notice small changes. People exactly like me. I moved out within a week. I left behind furniture, kitchen supplies, even my television. I didn't want anything connected to that apartment. The strange part is that I still catch myself looking at ceilings, hotels, apartments, Airbnbs, anywhere. I automatically check access panels and crawl spaces, not because I expect to find someone, because I know it's possible. That's what makes this story different from most things people are afraid of. There's no ghost, no monster, no unexplained mystery, just a person, a real person, living above my head while I slept. And honestly, that scares me a lot more than anything supernatural ever could. A few years ago, my friend Marcus worked overnight security at a large hospital in St. Louis. The hospital wasn't old enough to be considered historic, but parts of it dated back to the 1970s. Over the years, multiple renovations had connected different buildings together. As a result, the layout was a mess. Hallways led nowhere. Storage rooms appeared behind locked doors. Entire sections of the hospital were rarely used. Marcus worked the night shift, usually from 11 p.m. until 7 a.m. Most nights were quiet, check doors, monitor cameras, respond to occasional calls, nothing exciting. One night, around 2 a.m., he was making rounds when he got a call about a maintenance alarm on an upper level. He entered an elevator near the surgical wing and pressed the floor number he'd been given. The elevator started moving. A few seconds later, it stopped unexpectedly. The doors opened. Marcus immediately knew something was wrong. This wasn't the floor he requested. The hallway looked unfinished. No signs, no patient rooms, no staff, just bare concrete walls and dim lighting. He stepped out and checked the elevator display. The panel showed floor 13. That didn't make sense. According to hospital maps, the building only had 12 floors, at least officially. Marcus assumed it was some kind of service level, maybe a maintenance area not listed on public maps. Still, something felt off. The hallway was silent, not normal hospital silence. Complete silence. No equipment, no voices, nothing. He radioed a dispatch, no response. He tried again, still nothing. Assuming the concrete structure was interfering with the signal, he continued forward. The hallway eventually opened into a larger section. What he found there immediately raised red flags. Someone had been living there. There was no question. A mattress sat in one's corner. Food wrappers covered the floor. Several battery-powered lanterns were hanging from pipes overhead. Whoever occupied the area had been there for a while. Marcus stopped walking. His first thought was squatter. His second thought was much worse. How had someone managed to live inside a hospital without being noticed? Then he noticed something else. A whiteboard mounted to the wall, covered in writing, schedules, names, shift times, employee parking locations, hospital staff information. The names weren't random. They belonged to nurses, doctors, security personnel, including Marcus. His name appeared 3 separate times, along with the hours he normally worked. At that point, he decided to leave, immediately. As he turned around, he heard something move, not far away, a metallic clank. Then footsteps, his entire body locked up. The footsteps weren't approaching quickly. They were slow, careful, intentional. Someone knew he was there. Marcus grabbed his flashlight and aimed it down the corridor. Nothing. The footsteps stopped. For several seconds, neither side moved. Then another sound echoed through the hallway. A door closing somewhere deeper inside the floor. That was enough. Marcus headed straight back toward the elevator, fast, not running, but close. When he reached it, he repeatedly pressed the call button. Nothing happened. The elevator didn't respond. Then he heard footsteps again, closer this time, much closer. He finally abandoned the elevator and took the emergency stairs. He didn't stop until he reached an occupied floor. The moment he stepped into a normal hallway, the hospital sounds returned. Phones, voices, machines, people, everything. Marcus immediately reported what happened. Management took it seriously, very seriously. The next morning, security and maintenance teams searched the area. What they discovered was surprising. The floor did exist, technically. It had originally been planned during construction decades earlier. But portions were never completed. Most employees didn't even know it was there. Over the years, access records became inconsistent. Eventually, the level was forgotten, at least by most people. Investigators discovered multiple unauthorized entry points leading into the space. Evidence suggested at least one person had been living there for months, possibly longer. The individual was never identified. By the time authorities searched the floor, they were gone. But the whiteboard remained, along with detailed information about dozens of hospital employees, including Marcus. To this day, he refuses to work overnight security. People always ask him if he was scared because the floor wasn't on the map. The truth is, that wasn't the scary part. The scary part was realizing somebody had spent months secretly watching hospital staff, learning their routines, tracking their schedules, and nobody knew they were there. Because sometimes the most dangerous places in a building aren't the ones everybody knows about. They're the ones people forgot existed. A few years ago, I worked overnight security for a medical complex outside Detroit. Most of the campus was active, but one building wasn't. The oldest hospital wing had been shut down years earlier. The plan was eventually to renovate it. But funding delays kept pushing the project back, so the building sat empty, floor after floor, room after room, completely abandoned. At least that's what everyone believed. Part of my job involved checking exterior doors and responding to alarms across the property. The abandoned wing was technically included in those rounds, but nobody liked going inside. Not because people thought it was haunted, because the place was unsettling. Peeling paint, broken furniture, long empty hallways. The kind of building where every sound echoes. One night around 2:45 a.m., an alarm came through. Motion detection. Second floor, old hospital wing. I assumed it was another false alarm. The building generated them all the time, usually loose plastic sheeting or birds finding their way inside. Still, protocol required a response. I grabbed my flashlight and headed over. The moment I entered the building, something felt different. Not supernatural, just wrong. The air smelled fresh. That probably sounds strange, but abandoned buildings usually smell stale, dusty, unused. This place smelled like somebody had recently opened windows. As I climbed the stairs, I noticed something else. A water bottle, half full, sitting in the middle of the hallway. That definitely shouldn't have been there. I radioed dispatch and continued upstairs. The second floor was supposed to be empty, but there were signs of activity everywhere. Recent footprints in dust, food wrappers, fresh cigarette butts. Someone had been spending time there. Then I heard movement, a door closing somewhere ahead. Not slamming, just quietly shutting. My stomach immediately tightened. I wasn't dealing with a false alarm anymore. Somebody was inside. I followed the sound toward an old patient ward. The flashlight beam swept across empty rooms and broken equipment. Then I noticed a faint glow coming from one doorway. Light, actual light. Inside a building without power. I approached carefully. When I looked inside, I froze. The room wasn't abandoned anymore. Someone had transformed it into a living space. There was a mattress, portable lanterns, food supplies, batteries, several folding chairs, and something that bothered me more than anything else. Files. Stacks of hospital files, hundreds of them. Patient records, staff schedules, maintenance reports, all spread across the room, like somebody had been studying them. I immediately backed away. Then I heard footsteps, close, very close, not ahead of me, behind me. I turned around. The hallway was empty, but I knew I wasn't alone anymore. Someone knew I was there. At that point, I stopped investigating. Security officers aren't police, and I wasn't about to search an abandoned hospital by myself. I headed back toward the stairwell. As I moved, I could hear footsteps matching mine from somewhere deeper inside the ward. Not running, not chasing, just keeping pace. Following. Every time I stopped, they stopped. Every time I moved, they moved. It felt deliberate, like whoever was there wanted me to know they were nearby. I finally reached the stairwell and got out of the building. Police arrived about 20 minutes later. They searched the wing thoroughly. What they discovered shocked everyone. A former contractor had apparently been accessing the abandoned building for months, possibly longer. He had learned maintenance routes during renovation work years earlier, using forgotten entrances and utility corridors. He'd been living inside sections of the hospital without anyone realizing it. The files investigators found weren't random. He'd been collecting information on employees, contractors, and former patients. Nobody ever got a clear explanation why. The man disappeared before police arrived. He was eventually located months later in another state. What sticks with me isn't the idea that somebody lived there. It's how close we all came to never knowing. Thousands of people worked on that medical campus, every day, every night. And meanwhile, someone was secretly living inside a building everyone assumed was empty. When people hear abandoned hospital, they usually think about ghosts. I don't. Because after what I saw, I learned something. Sometimes the scariest thing in an abandoned building isn't what's left behind. It's who's still there. The station sat directly off a long stretch of highway surrounded by miles of open desert. At night, the place felt isolated, really isolated. The nearest town was over 30 minutes away. After midnight, customers became rare. Most shifts were quiet, too quiet. One night around 2 a.m., I was cleaning coffee machines when a semi-truck pulled into the parking lot. The truck came in fast, way too fast. The driver slammed on the brakes, jumped out, and practically ran toward the entrance. The moment he entered, I knew something was wrong. He looked terrified, not nervous, not stressed, terrified, sweating heavily despite the cold weather, constantly checking the windows, looking over his shoulder. He reached the counter and immediately said, "Lock the doors." I laughed awkwardly. I honestly thought he was joking. He wasn't. Lock the doors. Right now. Something in his voice convinced me. I walked over and locked both entrances. The driver visibly relaxed, only slightly. Then he asked if anyone else was inside. I told him no. He nodded and moved away from the windows. The whole situation felt bizarre. Eventually, I asked what was going on. The driver hesitated before answering. Then he said, "I think someone's following me." At first, I assumed road rage. Maybe another truck driver. Maybe somebody angry about traffic. But he shook his head. No. Same vehicle for almost 4 hours. That got my attention. He explained that he first noticed a dark SUV several hundred miles earlier. Every time he stopped, the SUV stopped. Every time he changed routes, it followed. Never approaching, never passing, just staying behind him, watching. The longer he talked, the more uneasy I became. Then I noticed something. A dark SUV entering the parking lot. My stomach immediately tightened. The driver saw it too. He stepped away from the front windows. The SUV parked near the edge of the lot, engine running, headlights off. Nobody got out. For nearly 15 minutes, it just sat there. The truck driver refused to leave. I couldn't blame him. Eventually, I called local law enforcement. While we waited, the SUV remained parked exactly where it was. Then something happened. The passenger door opened. A man stepped out. Instead of approaching the station, he walked around the parking lot, slowly, looking at vehicles, looking at the building. Almost like he was conducting surveillance. The truck driver looked sick. He immediately recognized him. Apparently, the same man had appeared at 2 separate truck stops earlier that night. Always watching, never speaking, never getting close. At one point, the man stopped and looked directly through the gas station window. Not at me, at the truck driver. Then he smiled. That was enough. The truck driver moved farther back into the store. The man eventually returned to the SUV. A few minutes later, police arrived. The SUV left immediately. Officers attempted to stop it. The vehicle fled. A short pursuit followed before the driver abandoned it on a back road and disappeared. Investigators later discovered the SUV had been stolen weeks earlier. Inside, they found maps, burner phones, binoculars, and detailed notes about truck routes throughout several states. Nobody ever publicly explained why. The truck driver never learned exactly who was following him. Neither did I. But I remember one thing he told me before leaving. After giving his statement, he looked at me and said, "You know what's scary? I don't think they wanted the truck." I asked what he meant. He stared out the window for a second, then replied, "I think they were waiting for me to stop somewhere alone. I've worked plenty of overnight jobs since then. But whenever somebody comes into a business looking genuinely terrified, I pay attention, because sometimes people aren't overreacting. Sometimes they've already realized something is wrong long before everyone else does. And sometimes the safest place you can be is behind a locked door with a stranger who's just as scared as you are." About 6 years ago, I worked for a company that handled inspections of abandoned industrial sites throughout the Midwest. Most jobs involved documenting old buildings before demolition or redevelopment. The work wasn't exciting. Usually, it meant taking photographs, noting structural damage, and making sure nobody was illegally occupying the property. One particular assignment brought me to an abandoned manufacturing plant outside Cleveland. The factory had been closed for nearly 20 years. Most of the buildings were empty. The property itself was enormous. Several warehouses, administrative offices, storage buildings, and beneath it all, a network of old maintenance tunnels. The tunnels were originally used to carry utilities between different sections of the facility. Steam lines, electrical systems, water pipes. Most had been abandoned decades earlier. My job that day was simple: inspect several underground sections and photograph any safety hazards. I arrived around noon. The weather was clear. Everything felt routine, at least at first. The tunnel entrance sat inside an old maintenance building. A concrete stairwell descended underground. As soon as I entered, my radio signal became unreliable. That wasn't unusual. Concrete tends to interfere with communication. I switched on my flashlight and continued downward. The tunnel stretched farther than I expected. Concrete walls, low ceilings, long straight corridors disappearing into darkness. Every sound echoed. Even my own footsteps sounded distant. For the first 20 minutes, nothing happened. I took photographs, made notes, checked utility access points. Normal work. Then I found something strange. A plastic water bottle, half full, sitting beside the wall. Not old, not dusty. Recent, very recent. That immediately got my attention. The site was supposed to be vacant. Nobody should have been down there. I photographed the bottle and continued. A few minutes later, I found more evidence. Food wrappers, a flashlight battery, a blanket folded neatly behind an equipment cabinet. My stomach tightened. Someone had definitely been spending time underground. The deeper I went, the more signs I found. Eventually, I reached a junction that wasn't marked on any of the facility maps. That bothered me. The company had provided detailed blueprints. This corridor wasn't supposed to exist. I followed it anyway. About 50 yards in, I found something that made me stop completely. A makeshift living area, not large, just enough space for one person. There was a sleeping bag, food supplies, water containers, portable lights, everything needed to survive underground. The setup looked organized, permanent. Whoever used it had been there for a long time. At that point, I decided the inspection was over. Finding an unauthorized occupant wasn't part of my job description. I turned around and started heading back. Then I heard it. A door closing somewhere behind me. Not a loud slam, just a metallic click. The kind of sound that instantly tells you somebody else is nearby. I stopped walking. The tunnel became silent. For several seconds, nothing happened. Then I heard footsteps, slow footsteps, far away, but definitely human. My pulse immediately accelerated. I called out, no response. The footsteps continued, not approaching quickly, just moving, steadily, deliberately. I started walking faster. The footsteps matched my pace. I walked faster. The footsteps sped up too. That's when I stopped trying to be calm. I headed directly toward the main tunnel, fast, not running yet. Every few seconds, I glanced behind me. Nothing. The corridor remained empty, but the footsteps never disappeared. The worst part was the echoes. I couldn't tell exactly where the sound was coming from. Only that it was getting closer. Eventually, I reached the main section and radioed my supervisor. For the first time all afternoon, the signal worked. I explained what I'd found. His response was immediate. "Leave now." I didn't argue. I started jogging toward the stairwell. The footsteps behind me became louder, closer, close enough that I stopped doubting myself. Someone was absolutely down there, following me. I finally reached the stairs and climbed as fast as I could. The moment I stepped outside, I turned around. Nobody emerged. The stairwell remained empty. Police searched the tunnel system later that evening. They discovered multiple hidden living spaces throughout the underground network. Several entrances had been concealed behind old maintenance panels. Evidence suggested one or more people had been using the tunnels for years. Nobody was located during the search, but investigators found something else. Maps, detailed maps, not of the tunnels, of the employees and contractors who visited the site. Vehicle descriptions, work schedules, inspection records, including mine. According to police, whoever occupied the tunnels had likely been monitoring activity above ground for a long time, long enough to know exactly who entered the property and when. The factory was eventually demolished. The tunnels were sealed permanently. Most people assume that's the end of the story. Maybe it is, but every now and then I think about that day, specifically the footsteps. The strange thing wasn't that somebody was living underground. The strange thing was how comfortable they seemed. Like I was the one trespassing, like I'd wandered into their space. And maybe I had. Because sometimes the most disturbing places aren't hidden from us. They're hidden beneath us. And the people living there don't want to be found. And that was the final story. If you're still here, thanks for spending part of your night with me. Out of all 25 stories, let me know which one disturbed you the most and why. I always enjoy reading through your thoughts after these compilations. If you enjoyed tonight's video and want more realistic horror stories every week, consider subscribing to Nightmare Reads. Until next time, stay safe, stay aware, and try not to think too much about the stories you heard tonight. Good night.